But the tomb was in a separate space, a majestic rotunda. It took longer to build the rotunda than it did to build the basilica. Because if you remember, the tomb was in a rock face, was in a cliff face. And to create this space, Helena's workmen had to remove all of the rock face that wasn't the tomb, to remove the entire cliff, if you like, in which the tomb lay. And to do it carefully enough that they would leave a stone shell around the burial chambers and create at the same time an open space, a kind of a sacred space all around the tomb.
Our next speaker is Dr. Roberta Ervine. She's been professor of Armenian Christian Studies at St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary in Armonk, New York since 2001. Prior to that time, she lived for many years in the Holy City, where she had the blessing and privilege of being mentored by both Archbishop Noray Bogharian, curator of manuscripts, and Bishop Gyurek Kapikyan, tireless overseer of the holy places for the Armenian Patriarchate. It is a small segment of what she has learned from study with Bishop Gyurek that she shares with us today. Welcome, Dr. Ervine.
Thank you, Deacon Yervant. Just 1 second here. Let's see if we can get ourselves to the right place. Is the slide showing up for everyone?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Excellent.
it is.
Okay. I'm glad it is, because I am so very excited to be standing on this spot today with you at the door of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, just as we are preparing in a few days to begin the celebration of Holy Week, which is going to culminate, as we all know, in the earth-shattering events that happened just a few feet from where we're standing. Events that happened, in fact, just a few feet from one another. It's quite amazing to think that in the limited space of 100 or so square feet, the world could be changed forever. Those of you who followed Vemkar's pre-pilgrimage posts probably saw the video tour of the church that Arpi Nikashin prepared as a preview of things to come today. The doorway and its courtyard may already look familiar to you from that. And for others of you, this doorway and courtyard may look familiar because you've been there. And if by some chance you missed the video and you haven't been there, well, welcome to one of the most complicated and compelling places on the planet. Holy Sepulchre Church complex is one of the oldest, probably the oldest, architectural symbol of Christian faith in the whole world. It has been in constant use by Christians for worship, commemoration, celebration, from the time of Christ's death and resurrection until today, despite regime changes, wars, persecutions, natural events like earthquakes and fires, and the relentless ravages that we all experience of passing time. 7 different ancient churches share this precinct. Armenians, Greek Orthodox, and Roman Catholics, shown here standing together in front of Christ's tomb. Ethiopians, Copts, Syriac Christians, Christians and Episcopalians have varying degrees of responsibility and rights of use in this holy place. And it's amazing, in spite of the frictions that inevitably arise when you have that many different Christian traditions worshiping side by side and interweaving with one another liturgically and in life. The elaborately choreographed worship cycles of these communities make an astonishing day to day, day in, day out display of what it's possible for Christian love, unity, and the ability to accommodate variety and difference can do for the expression of a faith that is one and yet various. So it's really interesting as I think back on it. In all my years of visiting this church, taking my students to this church for services when I taught in Jerusalem, going there frequently on my own, being taken there by my mentor to study details of its history and its structure, guiding pilgrims through the building, Armenians and others. Over all those years, no one ever said to me, "Oh, this is just the way I imagined it would be." Whenever I pictured in my mind the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, it looked exactly like this. Nope. Over the 20 plus years that I was there, not one person ever said that. I think that's partly because people who were raised on more Western depictions of the crucifixion and the resurrection, scenes more like this one, can find it very difficult to reconcile their own treasured, much more scenic notion of events with a place that's as crowded, as various, as interested in graphic drama, as smoky, and as boisterous, even downright dangerous, as the Holy Sepulchre undeniably is. And for those people who want to meditate on the events of Christ's passion in a tranquil setting that more resembles what they are used to thinking of, there is another option. In the 19th century, a pious British general visiting Jerusalem noticed a rocky outcropping outside the northern side of the city that looked suspiciously to his eyes like a skull. You can see the eye holes there. It does sit a good way outside the city wall. In fact, it's actually a bus station. And in his mind, that rocky outcropping fits so nicely with the description of Jesus's crucifixion at a place called Golgotha, which he assumed meant it must look like a skull to be the place of the skull, that he was just captivated immediately. And there were tombs, not just modern ones like the one that was at the top of that last photo, but also older ones, tucked in some distance behind the hill, in what he felt was a much more appropriate setting. And so, since this good general had no difficulty at all imagining that all of Christendom up to that point had been mistaken in its identification of the most important holy site of its faith, the garden tomb was born, where it is indeed possible to meditate, to read quietly about the events, to imagine oneself encountering the angel, to pray undisturbed. And I highly recommend that experience, actually. It's not one that you're easily going to have at the Holy Sepulchre itself. The Holy Sepulchre Church is not a straightforward, user-friendly structure. For one thing, there's really no way to see the whole thing at once. So it's actually hard to get a grasp of what its overall size and layout could possibly be. And even if you go up above the roofline, you just see more and more inexplicable pieces, and you still can't tell where the boundaries of this church are. Where does the Holy Sepulchre compound stop and the city begin? Which of those structures belong to it and which do not? And as you start noticing all these odd pieces with their different shapes and their kind of layered angles, you notice other odd things like, what's that hole in the roof right in front of the tower? What about this little tiny dome? Does it have anything to do with anything? What about these buildings toward the back? We can kind of see that, yes, there is an outer limit to the church proper because there's a street there, but there also seems to be some kind of a bridging structure across that street. So maybe that's not quite as clear as one would think. And on this side, that's definitely true. You can see the street below, but the structures seem to spill over that open space. You also notice that right in front of that, or in back of it, that hole in the roof of the building, that tower has arches that don't go anywhere. That's weird. And this is all stuck in the middle of residential and commercial buildings that bump right up against its walls, as if they want to be as close as possible to the church without actually violating its interior space. I had an Arab Orthodox teaching colleague in Jerusalem who once invited me over to his and his wife's home because he wanted to share with me the honor that he and his family felt that their humble home shared a wall with the holiest place of their Christian faith. But what is this collection of architectural odds and ends that we call a church, and how did it come to be in this kind of amorphous shape? So we need to go back in time. But before we go all the way back, maybe I should go back one. I can show you on this as well. Right at the bottom edge of this photograph is where the city wall of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus ran. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind how close this church is to what was once the city wall. And let's look at what occupied this space in Jesus's time, or a little before it even. This whole area, it's hard to imagine now that it's so built up, but this whole area where the Holy Sepulchre Church now sits and all the buildings around it was once a stone quarry. There was nothing here except holes in the ground where large blocks of stone had been hewn out by force for building projects on the other side of the wall. Exactly in the foreground of the picture, right at the edge of that quarry, is where the entrance to the church now stands. So as you can see, when this quarry was fully active, it created several large pits, as well as a series of irregular ledges. And it was at the top of one of those pits that Jesus was crucified. By the time it came to that, the outcropping was a little smaller as the area between it and the city wall had been chipped away more and more over the years. And you can see that whoever drew this depiction has indicated the spot with a little wall around it. But parts of the quarry that were no longer active were allowed to silt up. Things were planted there. Some of the open spots became water cisterns. It's always good to have more of those when you live in a climate as dry as Jerusalem. So this area shown schematically here with its ledges and its filled in areas. And here at the bottom, you can see this irregular line kind of representing the then wall of the city. Jesus would have been crucified then in sight of people passing by on the one side. And on the other side, he would be looking into this planted area, which had been repurposed, since you have all those lovely, convenient, even rock faces, for tombs to be cut in them. And here you can see one. Here's another. So if Jesus is crucified here, he would be looking into the tombs. That was kind of Roman sense of humor. So this little sketch helps us to see what the land looked like, the topography looked like. And this one shows us how close the cross and the tomb were to one another. A consideration, quite possibly, for a pious person like Joseph of Arimathea, who chose to honor Jesus by burying him, but carried him no farther than was necessary on a Sabbath eve, even if it meant giving up his own expensive new tomb to do it. So here we have a rocky outcropping, some pits around it, tombs across from it. And you know, if you were to lay the Holy Sepulchre Church's outline over this space, this is more or less what it would look like. And as we'll see later in the afternoon, parts of this quarry are still visible in the present church. So just keep that little piece of information in the back of your mind for later. We may get to those things, we may not get to those things. We'll see how time goes. But things didn't move immediately from quarry to church. In between, there were other events that seemed to the Christian community in Jerusalem devastatingly tragic. Started out easily enough. The Jerusalem city wall, not that long after the time of Christ, was extended out farther. And so this quarry with its cemetery became part of the city. Later, when Hadrian, who hated Jews, took over Jerusalem and exiled them from it and built in place of the temple, his own temple to Jupiter, he used this piece of undeveloped real estate right inside the city wall for the site of his new temple to Venus. So he built a platform across the quarry. And according to some descriptions of this structure, here you can see there's still a quarry pit there that's just been filled in, and there are others, a detail that will be important for Armenians later. Right over the Rock of Calvary, a statue of Venus was placed. Now, it couldn't possibly be any worse from the point of view of a Christian who has been visiting this quarry openly or surreptitiously. Now there's no access to these things, but you can imagine people don't forget where things happened, and you have some landmarks to help them remember exactly where things were. And oddly enough, the fact that this area was covered over by a temple was fortuitous because it preserved the Christian holy sites intact until the arrival in Jerusalem. Here's another sketch of it, just to give you an idea of the size of the compound. Until the arrival in Jerusalem of this woman, Queen Saint Helena, mother of Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. Helena made the trip to Jerusalem in order to support the city's Christians and their bishop. She made it in part as a kind of penance for the sins of herself and her family. And given their high status in life, you can imagine that those might have been substantial. And she also came in part to see, on her son's behalf, if the sites of Christ's passion, which they knew from scripture had happened within the city, could be recovered. And so we have an account of her visit by the historian Eusebius, who's roughly her contemporary. In fact, so was Krikolu Savoric, for the matter of that. Anyway, the upshot of Helen's visit, also the upshot of the fact that she and the city's bishop had an unlimited budget put at their disposal to memorialize the Christian sites and the victory of Christianity over paganism. The result of this combination of things, her faith, the unlimited resources, and the intention to turn this city into a hub of Christianity, the result was a vast building program that included churches in Bethlehem, on the Mount of Olives, as well as the complete replacement of Hadrian's temples by structures that would be even more splendid, but dedicated to Christ's death and resurrection. Now, when they say completely replaced Hadrian structures, that's not 100% true, because you wouldn't want to try to remove some of the very biggest stones from that structure. Besides, some of them are actually useful, as we'll see again later. And they were able to uncover the lowest pit in the quarry, the place where tradition said Christ's cross had been placed, thrown away actually, sometime after the crucifixion took place. So here's a cross section of Helena's church, Constantine's church. To get to it, one ascended by a very majestic staircase from the city's most posh shopping street. Pilgrims then entered a courtyard and a narthex so that the eyes could adjust to the lower level of light before stepping into this towering structure, 3-story high basilica that most of the time echoed with the sounds of song and prayer, passing pilgrims, services. The space was lined with mosaics in gold and crystal, with intricately patterned floors, and we are told, a coffered ceiling completely covered in gold leaf. So the light that would come in through the windows of the clerestory, that is the highest level, playing off all of the gold, the crystal, at different times of day, would create a celestial feeling about this long church. When the pilgrim walked to the end where the altar is, he had the choice to stay for whatever service was taking place, or to enter the side aisle and walk towards a small door near the outer wall of the complex. To walk through that small door meant to find oneself immediately in the physical presence of the raw rock of Calvary that stood kind of tucked into a corner, as it were, of an open space, a tranquil open air courtyard, decorated with trees and plants, to make it as much like the garden Scripture described for the meeting between Jesus and Mary Magdalene as possible. And it's easy to imagine a 4th century pilgrim, a 5th century pilgrim, standing beneath the arcade that bordered that space, becoming in his or her mind Mary Magdalene, becoming in his or her mind the disciples gathered for the crucifixion, becoming Mary, the Mother of God, as she stood and watched events unfold. There were rough stairs that led to the top of Calvary's rocky outcropping. It was possible to go up it, to touch the hole where the cross had stood. And in fact, if there weren't many people around, one could stand at the top where Christ's cross had stood, putting oneself in his place and looking towards the tomb as he had done. But the tomb was in a separate space, a majestic rotunda. It took longer to build the rotunda than it did to build the basilica. Because if you remember, the tomb was in a rock face, was in a cliff face. And to create this space, Helena's workmen had to remove all of the rock face that wasn't the tomb, to remove the entire cliff, if you like, in which the tomb lay. And to do it carefully enough that they would leave a stone shell around the burial chambers and create at the same time an open space, a kind of a sacred space all around the tomb. They accomplished this feat of engineering, and then over the jagged ball of rock, they put what they called a little house, an edicule, a kind of a pavilion set on slender pillars. The structure shows up on all kinds of pilgrimage souvenirs from the early church period. So here you have the kind of umbrella structure floating above pillars with open grills in front of it, allowing a kind of partial view of the tomb within. Inside that portico was the low door of the tomb, and inside that, the stone bench on which Jesus's body was laid, and a part of the rock marking the spot on which the angel sat, as Arpi described to us this morning. And an oculus directly over the tomb let in light. And so from time to time, there would be magical moments in the day. You can see the oculus up here, open to the sky. A ray of pure sunlight, depending on the season, would descend directly onto the tomb. Now, this was an awesome sight. And so people naturally tended to walk around the rotunda, not in that big open space, but behind the pillars, a little bit more respectfully distant from the tomb itself. And that space behind the pillars is called the ambulatory. And you can see niches that, if you put a door on them, would also be rooms off the perimeter of that ambulatory to house articles used for the church's staff and for its services. Well, structures that are built with this level of opulence, honoring though they are to the events that took place within them, are not destined to last. A lot of people could think of better uses for gold leaf than to coffer a ceiling in a church dedicated to an event in which they did not particularly believe. And so wars and governments that were hostile to Christianity made sure that Constantine's Basilica disappeared. And then when the church was rebuilt in the 11th century, the time of Cricorna Ragazzi, if you want to give that some thought, there is going to be a much more limited budget and much fewer resources. We'll look at that in a moment, but there are pieces of the Constantinian splendor that still remain if you know where to look for them. For example, if you go around the corner from the Holy Sepulchre Church, a little farther to the east, you'll see a little shop where some gentlemen are making very delicious things. And if you buy something appropriate, nobody will say anything if you step around to the edge of the counter and look at this. This is one archway from the grand staircase that led up to Constantine's Basilica. And there it sits just in the back of a shop, not bothering anybody. Or you could stay a little closer to the Holy Sepulchre Church. You could go to the Alexander Convent, the Alexander Church, which really doesn't look like a church, as you can see from this shot. Doesn't even look like a church when you get up close to it. However, if you go inside, the people there will be happy to show you another archway. Part of the second rank of arches. This one, perhaps on the first landing of that magnificent staircase. An archway that's still attached to a large piece of wall from that early era. And you begin to have a little bit of a glimpse into the size, the scope of structure that we're talking about. The staircase itself has been reconstructed, at least in part, based on the size of the elements that were found there and the space between the landing and the upper floor. There's more of it around beyond this large memorial cross that stands in the middle. But when it came to reconstructing the church in the 11th century, all of the Constantinian Basilica had to be written off as a loss. As far as we know, that whole area was left vacant. It was walled off. Pilgrims didn't go there. Instead, they now entered through what had been the side door into the garden or the courtyard area. And so a regular chapel, here's your courtyard, come in this door. A regular chapel was built on top of the Rock of Calvary, partly to preserve what was remaining of the stone and partly to create a larger, more convenient space for worship, because a lot of worship is going to take place here now that the basilica is gone and all kinds of weather conditions can pertain. So once the pilgrim had come in the door into this open space, reminding him of the garden, and gone up onto Calvary and come back down again by a second staircase, the pilgrim would then cross over into the rotunda through open archways. To the side, because as you can see here in the middle, an apse was built into the garden so that there could be a kind of grand altar for the space, even without the basilica. So when you compare it to what Constantine had done, you think, oh, well, you know, it's better than nothing. Would I have been able to do as much if I had budgetary restrictions? Would I have been so visionary? I don't know. But when the Crusaders came just 100 years later, they looked at this configuration and they said, well, we just liberated the city from Islam. This is not exactly what we had in mind as a great monument to Christ's support of our achievement. That little altar off the rotunda isn't going to do anything for us. We have a lot of people. We have large numbers of clergy. We have greater liturgical needs. So they knocked out that apse. It used to be sitting here. It's not anymore. Instead, they co-opted the whole garden, this central area here. They kept the chapel over Calvary, but they turned the whole garden into their church, their mother cathedral. They left it open so that people walking in would still have that feeling of walking into the garden, but they would be walking into the middle of a service, a worship space with a huge dome over the top of it. And then they extended the end here. They extended the three chapels at the back out into a kind of semi-rotunda. And we'll be looking at those chapels later. In other words, they made it a little mirror of the rotunda at the other end of the church, housing the tomb itself. And that basically is what we have today. Today's church is basically the same as the Crusader plan. Although, as we'll see a little later, changes have been made. You no longer get the feeling of a garden when you walk into the church, for example. So this, in a nutshell, shows us the changes. At the bottom, Constantine's Basilica, garden, and rotunda. In the middle, the blank space where the basilica had been, the truncated church, and in this picture above, the modern church, where this area of the basilica has been somewhat reclaimed. And there have been a lot of other things kind of accruing around the church to accommodate the needs of worship today. And we'll see that in more detail when we get inside the church. But for now, here we are, still standing at the door. And it's one of those places where if your tour guide doesn't rush you, or if you can come back on your own, the more you sit in this space, the more you realize that there are some curious, weird things about what you're looking at. For one thing, that doesn't really look like a grand entrance. The doors are grand, they're big, but they're too big for the space. And it looks like the doors are being squeezed on both sides. Plus, if we look at the eyebrow carvings over the windows, very beautiful ones, actually, we can see that they seem to carry on the left side, but they don't go anywhere. It's just kind of cut off. They go behind that tower, that bell tower. So that must have been added later. And then if you go to the right-hand side of the facade, you see that there's this strange set of stairs that seems to block part of the closed entrance. And there again, you have carving that just kind of peters off into nothing. So what's that all about? Well, it's actually pretty pedestrian, the explanation for this. The bell tower on the left and the stepped chapel on the right actually are what holds up the facade. As I said, there were budgetary constraints, and that meant that builders cut corners. They did not sufficiently reinforce the wall of the entrance. And so even by the time of the Crusades, 100 years after this was put up, it was already leaning outward at a really alarming rate. And this was not a permanent solution. For a lot of the years of the early 20th century, this is what the entrance to Holy Sepulchre Church looked like, because they had to have scaffolding holding the wall up physically until eventually, after wars interrupted and this and that happened, until they were finally able to kind of wire it together, attaching the front to the back with iron rods. But that's a saga for some other day. Anyway, this was the solution that the Crusaders came up with. Prop up one end with a bell tower, prop up the other with that odd-looking chapel, and turn them both somehow into important parts of the pilgrimage experience. So let's look first at the bell tower side. You can see that that tower sits above another structure that had 1, 2, 3 apses. There are 3 altars inside this. And you can also see that before this was filled in, there were also 2 very large, impressive arches that separated those apses from one another. And since this is where we saw the hole in our aerial photograph, there was once a dome over this. So you kind of have to subtract the upper darker yellow brick, put a dome on the top of this, take out this wall. And once you've mentally done that, then you can go through the door that you see there in the second arch, and you'll find yourself here. This was the baptistry for Constantine's Basilica. In the courtyard outside, Cyril of Jerusalem, the famous bishop, once delivered his Lenten catechetical lectures. And so candidates for baptism who were sitting there listening to him could look over their shoulder at the Rock of Calvary, which was not closed off at the time. And then they would look ahead into the baptistry where on Holy Saturday, or maybe on Easter morning, they would gather in this structure in the outer chapel that's closest to the street. And there they would remove the soiled clothing of their earthly life. And a deacon of their own gender would then escort them into the middle space to the baptismal pool in the middle chapel. And when they came out of the water and were robed in a clean white garment, they would walk through the doorway into the third chapel. This is 17th century carving from the door to the third chapel, which shows Adam and Eve among a lot of other things. This would be the chapel that's closest to the rotunda. And there, clothed in their white, lighted candle in hand, they would wait for their first encounter with the tomb of Christ. These three chapels were named for St. James, St. John, and this one for the 40 martyrs. So there's an obvious baptismal connection there. The 40 martyrs were martyred by water. What we don't see now is the door that led from here into the rotunda. You can see that door from the other side, and if we have time this afternoon, I'll show it to you. It's in the Armenian desjaran, in the Armenian sacristy, just in case you're wondering. Okay, so adding to the baptistry helped to shore up that left side of the facade. What function does that obstructive staircase chapel serve? You can see that there are actually two chapels. There's one above and one below, or at least there's an arch below. So here it is, blocking the doorway. If you look at it from above, you can see that this too is definitely an afterthought. The wall of the regular wall of the church is right behind it. And that lower chapel looks like it might once have been a doorway that got filled in with a mixture of irregular kinds of stone. I only ever saw this chapel open once. I'm sure it's open at other times. I just happened not to be there. It's the size of a shoebox. It has room for an altar, but the priest and the deacon who serve that altar are going to stick out into the courtyard. It's really quite fascinating. If we were to take that tiny chapel away, we would see that the structure above it was once a kind of a canopy on 4 pillars, maybe above a small doorway that had gone into the church at that location sometime earlier. Anyway, the upper chapel, the one that you get to by that staircase, is named for the sorrows of Mary, the Theotokos. And if you get to walk up those stairs and press your nose against the glass, this is what you'll see. Inside is this incredible golden altar. In the time of the Crusades, this was the 10th station on the Roman Catholic Via Dolorosa. And if you look just to the left top of this picture, you can see a capital there. If you turn your head farther towards that, you'll see something that's a little odd. There's this beautiful doorway. Incredibly fabulous carving, the best that a Crusader workshop had to offer. That doorway once led into the chapel commemorating the spot where Jesus was stripped of his garments before being nailed to the cross. Now you can't get there from here, but we will visit it from the other side. In other words, this upper chapel at the top of the stairs is the antechamber to the top of the rock of Calvary itself. Well, this is kind of interesting. If you have a chapel to Mary here, next to Golgotha, and right across the courtyard in the Baptistry is a chapel named for John, the disciple Jesus loved, the one to whom he entrusted his mother as he hung on the cross. That's an interesting coincidence. And that coincidence, plus an observant eye and a curious mind, led the Armenian Patriarchate's long-standing supervisor of the holy places to a very interesting discovery. The Armenians have a kind of a small closet, had a kind of small closet, where that doorway, the green doorway now is. And the supervisor noticed that weary pilgrims and tourists often sat on an odd-shaped stone, like they're doing here, between that doorway and the Chapel of Mary. That rock had to be a pillar. But a pillar from what? People don't just fling pillars about, the things are heavy. So this one was probably not very far from its original location. And when you stand back and look at this wall, shown nice and clearly here, although the depiction is not correct in other ways, you can see that there's an arch on that wall. And that's still clearly visible today. So how strange is that? Even though the south end of this arch has been changed in order to accommodate a window that was needed for the building behind it, the one on the north was never changed. And right at the bottom of the arch, the Holy Places supervisor noticed that there were two little horns of stone sticking out of the wall. And he wondered, what were the chances that those horns were actually the top of a capital on a pillar? Now, he was not expecting to find the whole pillar, but that's how it turned out. When he had his workmen chip away the stones that were below those two little horns, they turned out to just be like a one stone thick facing, and the column was still intact. And then he noticed the bases of several other columns are visible in the floor of the courtyard. So there had to have been at some point some kind of pillared Basilica church on this spot. And if there was a pillared Basilica church on this spot, we would be facing its altar apse. Could that be what that arch is? And so, very excited, he had the space behind that closet emptied out. And it turned out to be a vast pile of rubbish and dirt. And the whole apse gradually came into view. The apse of what had been, in the 7th century, a church of Mary and John, commemorating the space where they stood hearing the words of Jesus that would make them mother and son from that moment forward. And this is a very old and grainy photograph. There might be some people in this that some of you will know. In their much younger years, Armenians now use that altar apse for services. The people sit in the courtyard where the basilica once was. Anyway, here we stand, under the bell tower, between the Baptistry and the Church of Mary and John, beside the outer entrance to the Rock of Calvary, and we have not yet stepped through the door to go where everybody else is going. And before we do that, in a few minutes, I want to show you just one more thing quickly, the reason why people make this pilgrimage. And when you look at the lintels of those great doorways, they're now bare. But you can see that there were once spikes that held something in place there. When the Crusaders built them, the arch above each bay of this doorway was filled with intricate patterns of colored stones, and each lintel was very carefully carved. The carvings were removed when damage from pollutants in the air got to be too much, and they were placed for safekeeping in the Rockefeller Museum, which is not very far from the Damascus Gate if you ever want to go see them in real life. These lintels showed very clearly what the life-changing results of a face-to-face physical encounter with the death and resurrection of Christ could do to a pilgrim's life. All pilgrims entered the sacred precincts of the crucifixion and the resurrection through the eastern bay of the entrance, the one that's now closed. And so above them, animals and humans struggled in the grasp of a very tenacious, vicious vine. The toils and snares of the sinful world held them tightly in its grip as they writhed in pain and suffering, trying to free themselves from the vine's clutches. Then, after making the circuit from Golgotha, past the memorials of Christ's sufferings for our sake, through his encounters with Mary Magdalene and the myrrh-bearing women at the tomb, and having exited the church, here's a close-up of that vine of suffering. Exiting the tomb with their face towards the altar of the bloodless sacrifice of praise that all Christian churches now offer in thanksgiving for the events that happened here, all pilgrims left the church through the west bay of the door, the one that's still open. And above it, the events of Christ's life were carved in a very orderly and peaceful display of grace that ended on the far right with the revelation of his risen identity to the disciples on the road to Emmaus as he broke bread before them. Or is that actually a depiction of the feast in God's kingdom? So as we walk through these doors a little later, may what awaits us within have on our lives the same grace-filled effect that centuries of pilgrims before us have experienced.
Thank you, Dr. Ervine, for walking us back through time, enabling us to see what pilgrims through the ages would have seen coming to this same spot.